So yeah, thanks again for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today while I share my master's research project, Demography and Habitat Selection of Piping Plovers on the Niobrara River. So I'll begin by describing the Niobrara, and then I'll move into the specifics of my research project. From its headwaters in southeastern Wyoming, the Niobrara travels 900 kilometers eastward across Nebraska. As it nears its confluence with the Missouri River, it develops a wide channel and is braided with sandbars. The Lewis and Clark expedition traveled past the Niobrara in 1804, and Clark wrote, "This river comes rolling its sands, which is coursed into the Missouris, and is divided by a great many small islands and sandbars." River sandbars form during high flow events when sediment is carried and deposited. These images show the succession of how a sandbar forms and changes over time. So before the flood, there's a remnant sandbar in that upper right corner that's somewhat vegetated. And immediately after a flood, the sandbar has a large open area elevated above the water surface that's been deposited. Gradually over time, erosion breaks down the edge of the sandbar, and vegetation encroaches from the remnant area and from the bank. Though a sandbar like this one on the Niobrara may appear barren and unoccupied, these early successional areas provide habitat for a number of species. The Niobrara Valley itself supports a locally diverse array of flora and fauna, including over 100 species of breeding birds that use its riparian edge, forest, and prairie habitats. And in the middle of the riparian corridor, 2 species exclusively nest on the open sandbars, the piping plover and least tern. Plovers and terns lay their eggs in shallow scrapes that they dig in the sand, and they prefer to nest on large sandbars that are away from the water's edge to protect their nests from flooding and away from vegetation, which houses mammalian and avian predators. And we'll get into that in a lot more detail later on. So this type of sandbar habitat, open and unvegetated areas, is dependent on flood cycles that move and deposit sediment. Most Great Plains rivers have changed dramatically with human development, and parts of them will look very unfamiliar to Lewis, Clark, and Sacagawea today. The amount of river sandbar habitat has decreased sharply since widespread dam construction in the Great Plains, and plovers and terns are currently listed as threatened and endangered, partly due to the loss of this riverine sandbar habitat that they use for nesting and brood rearing. The Niobrara remains one of the least modified rivers in the Great Plains and might look somewhat familiar to Lewis and Clark if they saw it today. It has few dams and diversions and retains a relatively uninterrupted flow, which should be conducive to the creation and maintenance of that early successional sandbar habitat. The first documented account of plovers on the Niobrara indicates that they were common on large sandbars. Range-wide censuses conducted since the species was listed show that the Niobrara supports a substantial number of Nebraska's plovers, between 22 and 41%, which is about 100 to 200 individuals. However, despite the natural setting of the Niobrara and its history as an important plover nesting site, one stretch of the river has a population decline. The most downriver area of the Niobrara is part of the Missouri National Recreational River, and the National Park Service has surveyed for plovers annually since during the peak of nesting season. And from 2005 to 2010, this area had about 65 birds on average. Since that time, however, the population has declined and has remained low, averaging only about 15 birds counted during annual surveys. It's typical for plover populations to fluctuate over time, as is clear in the pre-2010 data, but the consistently low use of the Niobrara since 2010 poses important questions about what's happening to this population and what's potential causes of the population decline. So my thesis addresses this big question in 2 parts. First, by estimating survival and dispersal at multiple life stages, I aim to identify which demographic parameters are related to population decline, and then investigate what environmental factors are affecting survival dispersal. And then second, given the critical role that habitat plays in regulating plover populations, I looked at how habitat changed over time on the Niobrara, including what habitat features plovers select and how these features relate to reproductive success. So I'll give you a little more background on the species, and then we'll get into the methods and results on the demography. Piping plover males establish and defend nesting territories that are about 2/3 of a hectare in size. They typically have 1 4-egg clutch that is incubated in intervals by both adults for about 28 days. Chicks are precocial, and they're able to walk and forage soon after they hatch. And adults and chicks preferentially forage along water lines where invertebrate prey density is high. After about 25 days, chicks have grown enough to be able to fly and are independent or fledged. Plovers migrate to the Gulf and Atlantic coasts and the Caribbean to winter, and then they return again in the spring. They often have high site fidelity and will sometimes return to the same sandbar year after year to nest. The focus of my project is piping plovers, but I included some least turn data in the habitat analysis because plover and tern nesting habitats overlap spatially and temporally, sometimes to the extent that terns will use an old plover nest scrape instead of digging their own. So they're similar, terns and plovers are similar in many ways, but some differences are that terns have a 3-egg clutch that's incubated for only 21 days. And adults forage for small fish and other prey that they feed to their chicks. Common causes of nest failure for both species are flooding and predation. Because they're located directly on the ground, eggs and chicks can be washed away or flooded as river flow increases. Common nest and chick predators are coyotes, raccoons, owls, crows, and mink. So in order to address our research questions, we collected field data related to survival, reproductive success, and movement. We searched all available sandbar habitat for nests, and when we found them, we recorded their location, estimated their incubation stage, and then that allowed us to calculate their estimated hatch date. We returned to each nest 1 to 2 times per week to check on it and determine if it was still active and assess nest fate. Although it's a common management practice to exclose nests with cages that protect them from predators, none of the nests in this study were exposed. If you look really closely in that photo, you can see the egg at the very bottom. It's well camouflaged. So we captured adult birds by placing a small trap over their nest and individually marked them with a combination of plastic colored light bands. We also attempted to capture each chick and band it as close to hatch as possible. We regularly searched all sandbar habitat for banded birds by surveying in teams and recorded the date and location that each individual was observed. Our overall study area is located in the Great Plains range of the piping plover, which is indicated in pink on that inset map, near the border of Nebraska and South Dakota. The area of the Niobrara River outlined in black is the sandy portion that supports breeding plovers. Our main study area was the lowermost 65 kilometers of the Niobrara, which is the area managed by the Park Service that has had the population decline. My field crews collected data in 2015 and 2016, and I incorporated data collected by the Park Service and Virginia Tech on the Niobrara dating back to 2010, so we could explore long-term trends. Adjacent to the Niobrara population are 2 other important plover populations on the Missouri River, which I'll call Lewis and Clark Lake and Gavin's Point Reach populations. And Virginia Tech has been working on these sites since about 2005. I incorporated nest and chick monitoring data from part of the Lewis and Clark Lake so that I could compare demographic rates between these adjacent sites and improve our sample size. On the rest of the Niobrara, Lewis and Clark Lake, and all of the Gavin's Point Reach, the areas outlined in yellow there, we didn't monitor nests for this study, but we did survey for banded birds. By surveying for birds throughout the regional population, we could see how they were moving from site to site between years. So overall, we located 1,837 birds across all of the sites. The Missouri River is much larger than the Niobrara, and as such, it supports a much larger plover population. We monitored 521 nests and 465 chicks in that Lewis and Clark Lake segment, and 150 nests and 66 chicks in the Niobrara segment. So now that we had 7 years of data at our hands, we could put it to use in various demography models. Understanding population change means looking at 4 basic components: births, deaths, immigration, and emigration. So just as a broad example, your population would be in decline if birth rate outpaced death rate and emigration rate outpaced immigration rate. For our piping plover study, we applied this concept at 4 important stages of survival in their life cycle. And we also applied it to dispersal in and out of that system. So I'll introduce each analysis briefly, and then get into how we modeled them and what we found. We looked at nest survival, and sometimes I'll use the Greek letter phi to abbreviate survival. Chick survival, a chick being a bird aged from 0 days to 25 days when they reach fledgling age. Hatch year survival, which means survival from the time that they hatch to the time that they finish their first breeding season, which I will abbreviate HY. These birds look a little different. They have light colored plumage until their first breeding season. And adult survival, which is any bird that's more than 1 year old. We looked at dispersal between sites, or immigration and emigration, which I sometimes abbreviate with the Greek letter psi. By calculating survival at each of these life stages, that covers the birth and death component. And by observing how birds moved between Niobrara, Lewis and Clark Lake, and Gavin's Point Reach, we could get immigration and emigration. So there were two variables that we expected would influence survival and dispersal. First, we expected that river flow would negatively affect nests and chicks. Earlier, I mentioned how important river flow is to the creation of sandbar habitat, which benefits plovers. But river flow is really a double-edged sword because high water events or floods that occur during the spring are longer in duration, and those are the ones that build sandbars. But when flooding occurs during the summer, once plover nests and chicks are out, that flooding can erode sandbars and can wash away nests and chicks. So we acquired streamflow data from USGS streamflow gauges and calculated the maximum daily streamflow to capture those peaks in water level. The second variable that we thought would affect our population was habitat availability. So we looked at how much habitat was available at a site given to what was available throughout the region. And we thought that would affect how which site a plover decided to nest on in that year. So from year to year, sandbar habitat shifts, and we thought the birds would move from low habitat areas to high habitat areas. Specifically, we expected the population decline to be related to a massive habitat creation event that occurred on the Missouri River. And we thought that birds would leave the Niobrara for this new Missouri River habitat. So these images show how habitat changed over time in just a portion of the Lewis and Clark Lake. Before this habitat creating flood, there was everything was pretty much vegetated on Lewis and Clark Lake in 2009. 2010 and 2011, that's when the flooding occurred and most of the habitat was submerged. And then in 2010, you see in those bright white areas, those are all new sandbars that are elevated above the surface of water that provide great nesting habitat for plovers. So we integrated these two variables into our models and looked at the effect of maximum river flow on nest and chick survival and the effect of regional habitat availability on dispersal. So now we'll get into the analysis methods and the results for those. I calculated nest survival using logistic exposure models. We included basic covariates and a random effect for annual sandbar specific variation. And to those we added our river flow covariate. The logistic exposure model accounts for the fact that the probability of surviving a given interval depends on how long that interval is. And it's appropriate for data when you find nests at different ages, because it takes into account that some nests would have failed before you ever found them. Apparent nest success, which is just the rate that we observed in the field, was 27% on the Niobrara and 37% on Lewis and Clark Lake. The known predation rate was 13% on Niobrara and 45% on Lewis and Clark Lake, but it could have been up to 43 and 90% hypothetically, given that there were some unknown causes of failures that were likely due to predation, where any signs were washed away, like animal tracks or eggshell. Nest flooding was the main cause of failure on the Niobrara. Almost half of the failures were due to flooding there. And it was relatively rare on Lewis and Clark Lake. So the probability of surviving until hatch from those logistic exposure models was 21% on the Niobrara, and it varied by year on Lewis and Clark Lake, but on average was 23%. And this figure shows how those values that we observed compared to observations across the species range and shows how in general they're quite low compared to other observations. In this figure, the light gray bars show studies where the nests were not exposed, just like the ones in our study. And the crosshatch bars show where there were cages placed around nests to protect them from predators. And those black bars just show the predicted survival rates that they modeled in this study at a site that also has a lot of flooding. So at both sites, river flow was the strongest predictor of nest success, and nest survival was highest at low river flow. We scaled and centered our river flow data for each site separately. So the x-axis here shows how the departure from the site mean value at each site affects nest survival at that site. Because the Niobrara and the Missouri River are so different with how they flow, it was more appropriate to look at that river flow data specific to the site. So for example, on the Niobrara, at 1 standard deviation above the mean for river flow, you have a almost 0 probability of nest survival to hatching. To calculate chick survival from hatching to fledge, we used a Cormack-Jolly-Sieber model. Again, we incorporated a year variable to capture that stochastic annual variation and basic variables known to affect chick survival, chick age, and hatch date. And to that, we added our covariate for river flow. Because there were so few chicks on the Niobrara, we incorporated a fixed effect for Niobrara or Lewis and Clark Lake so that we could improve our sample size of those lake birds. So over time, chick survival decreased at both sites. And after that flood created habitat in 2012, when survival was high, it's decreased over time since. To put these results in the context of typical chick survival rates in the region, long-term data from the non-declining Gavin's Point Reach population found a 55 to 75% probability of survival from hatch to fledge. So our values sometimes fell within that range, but over time, they dropped below it. Chick survival decreased as river flow increased at both sites, although the effect was nearly 6 times as strong on the Niobrara as Lewis and Clark Lake. And the effect was significant on the Niobrara, but not on the lake. Previously, chick survival has been linked to, river flow has been indirectly linked to chick survival, as increased river flow will submerge those prey-rich areas along sandbar edges that they use for foraging. But on the Niobrara, we observed that sometimes after high flow events, chicks mysteriously disappeared. And this strong effect of flow provides extra support that flooding is also a direct cause of chick mortality on the Niobrara. To model adult and hatcher survival, we used a multi-state mark recapture model. So we kept this model simple, just including variables for yearly variation and expected higher survival of adults than hatch years, and age and hatch date dependent survival of hatch year birds, similar to that chick survival model. Apparent annual survival was higher for adult birds than for hatch years, which we expect since, remember, those hatch year birds, that includes the time since they were hatched until they're 1 year old. Survival didn't differ among the 3 sites, Lewis and Clark Lake, Gavin's, and the Niobrara. And overall, it generally increased over the time period that we looked at. The values that we observed were similar to those within the region and range-wide, and even higher in some years. So this similar or higher survival rates that we observed compared to other sites where populations were not in decline suggests that the Niobrara population decline was not related necessarily to survival of adults and hatcher birds. So this multi-state model that we use for survival also estimates the rate at which birds move from site to site between years. So in our model, these different states are the different breeding sites, Niobrara, Gavin's, and Lewis and Clark Lake. We included basic covariates for annual age and site-specific dispersal, and added a predictor for how regional habitat availability affected both immigration and emigration. So we expected that habitat availability at a given site would affect their decision to stay at that site or to move somewhere else. This figure has a lot going on, so we'll parse it out bit by bit. First, age class did affect dispersal probability, and hatchers were more likely to move from one site to another between years, which we expected because Adults are typically site loyal, and hatchers typically show natal dispersal. The dispersal rate changed based on which site you started at. So the emigration rate from the Niobrara, which I've outlined in blue here, was high, notably to Lewis and Clark Lake, which is the left-hand bar there. There was about a 50% chance that a bird would leave the Niobrara for Lewis and Clark Lake from one year to the next. Adults are typically highly site loyal, so there was a nearly 40% chance that adults would change sites, indicates that this could be a major contributor to the decline that we observed. Some of this was likely due to the Niobrara harboring birds during that flood event that occurred on the Missouri River in 2010 and 2011. A lot of those birds were flooded out, moved to the Niobrara for a few years to get refuge, and then moved back to the Missouri River. So some of this is accountable to that, but certainly not all of it. If we look at immigration into the Niobrara system, it was much lower than emigration out of it. There were not as many birds coming into the system from Lewis and Clark Lake and Gavins as there were leaving it. If we look at how these values relate to regional trends, an earlier study of regional interchange showed that in a typical non-disturbance year, there was about an 8% probability that birds would change sites, in this case between Gavins and Lewis and Clark Lake. When flooding changed the relative habitat availabilities at these sites in this study, the dispersal probability increased to 32%. But still, in our study, the dispersal rate of birds out of the Niobrara was much higher than this. So lastly, we looked at how habitat availability affected these immigration and emigration rates. Habitat availability had a weak effect, and it was different for adult and hatcher birds. Hatcher birds were more likely to leave the Niobrara when habitat availability was low there. And this makes sense because typically adults select their nest sites earlier in the year, and they're more competitive. So if habitat availability is low, then hatcher birds would be forced to look somewhere else if all of the good territories have been claimed already by adults. And for adults, the probability of leaving the Niobrara increased when there was more habitat, which is sort of counterintuitive, but we think this may be related to, again, those birds reassembling after those Missouri River floods in 2010 and 2011. Remember that they moved back into that habitat after using the Niobrara as refuge during that time. It also might reflect a difference in habitat quality between the two rivers. We use the area of wet and dry sand as our measure of suitable nesting habitat in this study, which is what's been used previously in Missouri River research. And the proportion of wet sand, which is typically not as high quality for plovers, was much higher on the Niobrara than on Lewis and Clark Lake or Gavins Point Reach. So the moisture, the wetness of those Niobrara sandbars might have made them less enticing to plovers when their alternative option was newly created tall Lewis and Clark Lake sandbars. Okay, so to summarize all these results, we estimated nest, chick, hatcher, and adult survival, and hatcher and adult dispersal. We looked at how these values compared across the region and range-wide to identify what might have contributed to this population decline on the lower Niobrara. Nest survival was low and was negatively impacted by river flow. Chick survival varied, but generally decreased over time and was also negatively affected by river flow. Hatcher and adult survival were within the range of other populations that were not in decline. And adult and hatcher dispersal from the Niobrara was high, even when habitat was available on the Niobrara. Some of this was due to birds returning to Lewis and Clark Lake after seeking refuge from Missouri River floods, but that didn't account for all of it. So there are several conclusions that we can draw from these results. First, the strong effect of flooding, even at just one standard deviation above the mean, suggests that Niobrara sandbars aren't tall enough to protect nests and chicks from washover. In this photo, sorry it's grainy, but it shows one of our Niobrara nests that was washed out during a period of slightly increased river flow. Second, high flows decreased nest and chick survival on both sites, but affected them much more strongly on the Niobrara River. Small flow increases have been shown to indirectly reduce survival through prey limitation, Plovers, remember, forage on those wet shorelines, and increasing water submerges that habitat. But on Niobrara, we expect there's also significant direct chick mortality from flooding. Third, we found that movements to Lewis and Clark Lake followed expansive habitat creation on that site. And previous research shows that birds move from low quality to high quality sites, which likely prompted a lot of this emigration out of the Niobrara. Lastly, the frequency of nest flooding and the high immigration rate may be linked to each other. Other populations have shown that plovers dispersed farther and more frequently following nest failure than following any other cause of failure. And because flooding is the main cause of failure on the Niobrara, some of the high emigration rate to Lewis and Clark Lake might be reflective of how our birds are responding to flooding. Okay, so having established those demographic rates and finding that they are affected by river flow and habitat availability, we can go into more depth into habitat selection on the Niobrara and see if the habitat features are related to reproductive success. In this chapter, we're narrowing our scope to just the area of the Niobrara that was monitored from 2010 to 2016 by Virginia Tech and the Park Service, where the Park Service has noticed a population decline since 2010. And this is where we add in the tern data. It did an a priori test to look at differences between tern and plover nest site selection on the site, and found that they were selecting similar habitats. So I pooled the data for these two species to improve our sample size. And in this habitat analysis, I'm looking at the habitat characteristics of nest sites and how those relate to nest success. So nest site selection could be based on a variety of fitness metrics, like the ones we discussed in the demography chapter. But we went with nest success because it's our best data set. So the first step in describing nest habitat characteristics is creating a land cover classification from aerial imagery. We developed a land cover data set for the study area using 1 meter imagery collected by the USDA National Agricultural Inventory Program, which is free, which is good. Although we surveyed for sites from 2010 to 2016, this imagery is only available in even number of years. So this analysis just includes 2010, 12, 14, and 16. We classified land cover using object-oriented methods in the program eCognition Essentials, which is a recommended method when your pixel size is small relative to your object of interest. So this image shows one sandbar on the Niobrara, and we'll just use that as a demonstration to see what type of habitat features we were extracting. So the first step in that classification process entails a multi-resolution segmentation in which adjacent pixels with similar spectral characteristics are grouped. So you can see these black outlines are formed around areas that are like each other. And second, a supervised classification was done on those objects. We classified land cover into 4 variables that were of ecological relevance to plovers. We've got dry sand nesting habitat, wet sand foraging habitat, dense vegetation, and water. Sparsely vegetated dry and wet sand are also included in their respective sand categories, but I mapped them out separately so you guys would have some more visual interest to look at here. So there were 3 factors that we thought would affect nest site selection and nest success. Sandbars can be dry or wet depending on their elevation, and we looked at the surrounding land cover to get an idea of how dry or tall a sandbar is. Detailed elevation data wasn't available for our study, so looking at how dry a sandbar is our metric for our best approximation of how tall it is, how elevated above the water surface it is. And it also gives us an idea of the land cover composition surrounding a nest. So you can see from top to bottom, the habitat is drier. In the middle, it's sort of damp. And that bottom photo shows quite a saturated sandbar. Predation is a common cause of nest failure in plovers, with the common nest predators being crows, raccoons, and coyotes on the Niobrara. And we expected plovers would avoid potential predator habitat by nesting away from the riverbank. As we saw in the demography chapter, flooding is also a major source of failure on the Niobrara. When river flow increases, it can submerge sandbars and wash away eggs. So we expected that nests would be located away from the water's edge to protect them from flooding. And you can see 3 examples of nests here that had various levels of flooding avoidance. The top nest was on that little elevated hump of sand, and it just barely survived. That nest actually hatched and fledged. The middle nest shows one where it was on the edge of a sandbar, and the water level rose enough that it washed those eggs out of the nest bowl, but the adults diligently rolled them back in, incubated them for a few extra days, and those ended up hatching and fledging. And that bottom one is a nest that flooded and did not make it. So we'll walk through an example of what this data looked like in our habitat classification. So imagine that this is a nest on that sandbar located in dry sand habitat. We extracted these 3 variables from our land cover data. We looked at the surrounding land cover to see what proportion of dry sand, wet sand, vegetation, and water were within 2/3 hectare of the nest. And if you remember way back to the introduction, that 2/3 hectare number comes from this hypothetical size of a piping plover territory. So we expected that nests would be in patches that were predominantly dry sand. We looked at how far each nest was to the riverbank. On the Niobrara, the riverbank is the nearest potential source of predators, and we expected that nests would be located away from the bank to protect them from predation. There were some vegetated islands and patches of dense vegetation on the sandbars, but most were quite small, less than a hectare, and we didn't expect that they would support predators. Third, we calculated the nearest distance from each nest to water. We expected, again, that plovers would nest away from water to reduce their risk of being inundated by increased water flow. We repeated these measurements for about 2 times the number of random points as actual points to differentiate the habitat of used versus unused locations. And the random points were restricted to habitat classes where nesting would actually occur, so not in dense vegetation or water. So then we developed a model set to compare which variables separated used sites from unused sites. Overall, we found that nest site selection was best described by the full model. The second model, which excluded only the distance to water variable, was also highly competitive. Distance to bank was the strongest predictor of nest site selection, and we centered and scaled all of these variables so that we could compare relative effect sizes. Surrounding land cover was also a significant predictor with a slightly lower effect size than distance to bank. And distance to water had a weak non-significant effect, with nests located no farther from water than random points. So plovers selected nest sites based primarily on the distance to bank, which is that potential predator habitat. The average distance was about 170 meters, which is quite similar to observations of 150 meters found in 2 other populations of plovers. Nest sites had a higher proportion of dry sand than did the random sites, with about 85% dry sand on average. And this specific metric hasn't been measured in other populations for direct comparison, but in general, Missouri river birds nested in sites with a higher proportion of dry sand compared to silt. And though we found no difference in the distance to water between nests and random points, nests were a similar distance from water as in other studies. Plovers may select nest sites about 50 meters from the water in order to have access to that high quality foraging habitat. Niobrara sandbars are also generally narrow, which may restrict how far a nest can possibly be from the water's edge. Overall, plovers avoided predator habitat and chose dry sand substrate, indicating some preference for elevated habitat that would be protected from flooding, but they didn't exhibit further flood avoidance by nesting farther from the riverbank than expected at random. Oh, sorry, farther from water. So our next step was to see how habitat features related to nest success. We used the same model set as we did in the previous analysis, but for response variable, instead of actual versus random, we looked at successful versus failed nests. Here there was no indication that successful nests were in different habitats than failed nests. There was considerable uncertainty in selecting a top model, and ultimately the null model proved to be the best supported. So while plovers did choose nest sites in dry sand patches that were located away from the bank, those features were not predictive of nest success. We quantified the area of each habitat type within the Niobrara to look at how land cover changed over time. And overall, the amount of dry sand, which you see in those white boxes at the bottom of the graph, decreased, and it was lowest in 2014. 2014 had more vegetation and wet sand than any other year. Overall, the amount of dry sand habitat was correlated with the number of nests, which you see indicated in the solid line. In 2014, there was basically no nesting on the Niobrara. The number of hatch nests indicated in the dashed line was not related to the amount of dry sand. So even though more sand brought more nesting birds to the Niobrara, it didn't necessarily mean that more nests would hatch. So this result is quite common across nest site selection studies. This figure is from a meta-analysis that shows that there's often incongruence between selection and success. For example, in that bottom figure, you can see that only in 20% of cases did habitat preferences parallel nest success for ground nesting birds. There are a few reasons why this may be so. Selection might be based on a different fitness metric than what we looked at. So we looked at nest success, but maybe it's based on chick survival. Second, nest success could be related to other habitat variables that we didn't measure, such as elevation or temperature. Or plovers could be using historical settlement cues that are decoupled from historical outcomes. So if plovers are selecting sites primarily for predator avoidance, which is typically the main threat to plover nest success, but they're facing the biggest threats from flooding, then we have a mismatch between nest site selection and nest success. So to tie it all together, we investigated a population decline and assessed habitat on the Niobrara River. We found that reproductive success was low and breeding dispersal was high, and that birds shifted between the Missouri and the Niobrara River as relative habitat availability changed. But overall, the Lewis and Clark Lake drew many birds from the Niobrara. Plovers selected nest site habitat based on the distance to predator habitat and the surrounding land cover. But nest success was not related to habitat variables. Very few Great Plains rivers have the relatively natural flow that the Niobrara has. Natural flood cycles create and maintain important sandbar nesting habitat for terns and plovers, but increased river flow is also a major source of nest and chick mortality. Timing is important when it comes to flooding. Sandbars, they are regenerated during extended spring flows that move sediment, and plover and tern nesting on the Niobrara generally begins as these flows recede in late May. When brief floods occur in the summer from heavy precipitation, water washes over the sandbars. It doesn't actually build them up. And when this happens, when nests and chicks are out, the eggs and chicks are at risk of being washed away. So this graph shows our actual data from 2016. And we didn't lose any nests due to flooding. They were all initiated during that period that was outside of the flood events. However, in that spike in late July, we did lose a number of chicks as the river flow really peaked in just a couple hours. A little flash flood came and submerged all the habitat. Because predation is often the main factor dictating nest success, it follows that nest sites were selected based mainly on predator avoidance. However, even nests that were in dry sand sites had no higher nest success rates, even though they were presumably elevated above the surface of the water, suggesting that plovers and terns on the Niobrara are facing levels of breeding season flooding that they're not prepared for. Over time, as the Niobrara habitat became wetter and more vegetated, fewer birds used that site. So these photos show a little bit of how saturated some of the sandbar habitat was and how vegetation encroachment occurs on the dry sand. Almost done. So concurrent with the Niobrara habitat decline, habitat creation on Lewis and Clark Lake provided abundant, high-quality habitat, those tall, dry sandbars for birds. The interchange of birds among breeding sites shows that the Niobrara is connected to the Missouri River population, which is expected for species that occupy early successional habitats. These habitats often shift among regional sites as it ages and becomes less suitable in some areas. And we observed that plovers moved between Lewis and Clark Lake and Niobrara as habitat availability changed between those sites. However, in this study, it was mostly an exodus from the Niobrara. These graphs are just a reiteration of what's happening on Lewis and Clark Lake to highlight the trends there. Because looking forward, ensuring that Niobrara habitat exists will help support the regional population. Nest and chick survival peaked following habitat creation on Lewis and Clark Lake in 2012, but since then it's already declined. And this may be due to over half of that habitat already becoming unsuitable for plovers as it has eroded and become vegetated on Lewis and Clark Lake. Although the Niobrara is one of the least modified rivers in the Great Plains that supports plovers, there's still human impacts that may affect sandbar habitat and its suitability for plovers moving forward. So this image shows the mouth of the Niobrara where it runs into Lewis and Clark Lake. And on either end of the Niobrara, there are Missouri River dams that slow the flow of the Missouri River and inhibit its ability to clear sediment from the mouth of the Niobrara. So what's happening is sand is backfilling in the Niobrara channel and effectively reducing the height of sandbars above the surface of the water. Additionally, there's a long-term upward trend in stream flow in the Niobrara during the breeding season. So this data is taken from the same stream gauge that we used in our study, and it shows how since 1960, there's been an increase in stream flow in both the spring, which is on the left, and the summer, which is on the right. Lastly, there's also a trend towards an increase in the frequency and intensity of storms in the central US, which can increase the frequency and magnitude of flash flooding that occurs. So these long-term trends towards lower elevation bars and increased river flow and storminess can continue to contribute to flood-related mortality of Niobrara piping plovers. To wrap it all up, plovers use dry sand patches that were away from the riverbank on the Niobrara. But for them to be successful, these nest sites must also provide protection from flooding. Identifying and promoting the processes that contribute to creation and maintenance of high elevation sandbars on the Niobrara is an important next step towards effective management of these birds and will also help sustain the regional plover population. So this project was the result of many people's hard work and dedication. I'd like to express special thanks to my committee, Dr. Dan Catlin and Jim Frazier in Fish and Wildlife, and Dr. Randy Wynn in Forestry, who helped tremendously with making this a reality. Thanks to the National Park Service for providing funding for this project and for providing historical data, especially to Lisa Yeager, a biologist with the Missouri National Recreational River, who helped make this project happen. Thanks to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for providing funding for the Missouri River portion of the study, and a special thanks to Coral Huber, who also helped provide some survey data and some logistical help with managing all of our equipment way out in the Great Plains when we're located here in Virginia. Thanks to Virginia Tech and for providing funding. And we had lots of help from Jim Jennings, who took us out on those airboating surveys and provided Mai Tais and cigars afterwards, apparently, as you're all privy to now. And thanks to Larry Strong at the U.S. Geological Survey Service for, for providing the Missouri River habitat classifications. Thanks to the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation and everyone in Virginia Tech Shorebird program. During this project, I had some great technicians who are amazing women who worked hard and had fun, and this would not have been possible without all of their dedication. And so thanks to them, as well as to the Missouri River crews who collected data long before I was here. And lastly, thanks to my family and friends for supporting me through this project, especially to my parents who road tripped down from Ohio to be here today. And with that, I'll leave you with this sentimental quote about the Niobrara and answer any questions you may have. And chug some water.
Plenty of time for questions, folks.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Mine wasn't extensive, but in the future, would you take with global warming in the news, would you take a temperature change as a variable for the habitat reproduction and of the plover?
Yeah, other studies have shown that temperature is the most important factor in determining nest success. It's not really something that we can control, so it's not necessarily a variable interest in this study because there's nothing we can do about it. But I would definitely say that's a concern looking forward, to just add another list of the things that climate change could affect. We do know that the eggs are sensitive to high temperatures. Anything over the 90 degrees can cause damage to the proteins in the egg. So yeah, increasing temperatures and climate change in general is a threat to the species.
As long as it's moist sand, they will nest in this wet sand.
That could cool the eggs, but it also probably means that they're more at risk of flooding. So yeah, it's another trade-off there. Yeah. But they do this adorable thing where they go and get their belly wet and then stand over the eggs to shade them, to cool them down. So they have some behavioral ways to compensate for high temperatures too.
You want the light?
Am I calling you?
Yeah, you go right ahead.
Okay.
I'm just here to keep an eye on the clock.
So I haven't fully formulated this question, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But do you think that is there any evidence that the plovers do some sort of like cost-benefit analysis between distance to predation and distance to foraging ground? So like, I think you said like 55 meters or something from the shore. So if the area you're working the sandbar was like twice as wide, would they still move further inland to be more the center of the island and further away from predation on either side? Or do they like have some sort of threshold where they want to be relatively close to the shore where they can forage, but far enough from predators to feel safe?
Right. It seems like this 50-meter distance that's consistent across studies shows that that kind of, if you look at the about 2/3 hectare to 1 hectare territory size, that's about the radius is about 50 meters. So yeah, there's a few puzzle pieces coming together that show that they want to incorporate that waterline in their territory. And some research in a different Nebraska site shows that for birds that do nest more inland in the interior of the sandbar, they will move their broods to about 50 meters from the waterline once those eggs hatch. So yeah, it does seem like they want to be within that distance to the waterline. And because it is just it provides a better forage. There's a lot greater like invertebrate density on those water lines. Is that kind of what you were asking?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So you hypothesized that perhaps the birds left the lake and came to the river and then went back to the lake.
Mm-hmm.
Did you look at the historical data? Were any of the birds banded that you could see did that movement?
Yeah.
The lake to.
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't included in the movement model because we don't have survey data from the Niobrara before 2011. But I pieced through the data and looked at band records and saw that, yeah, a good number of the birds that used the Niobrara in 2011 were Lewis and Clark residents that came there and then moved back once they could, go back home. So yeah, there was definitely that like temporary movement to Niobrara and then return back.
What is the reproductive lifespan of these birds? What I'm getting at is it seems that habitat creation by a big flood is episodic, maybe once every few years.
Mm-hmm.
So how many chances do they get to breed before they grow old and die?
Right, their lifespan is about 6 years. They're relatively long-lived for a shorebird. And the flood cycle, I've read on the Niobrara, it's about 2 years. On the Missouri, I think it's about 4 years. So that historical flood cycle is pretty consistent with their lifespan.
Suppose you were giving a talk to the Army Corps, and Park Service, and maybe a state agency or two, and you had distilled down your work to one or two things that they could do differently to really enhance conservation outcomes. What would those things be? Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, it does seem to all come down to the habitat and keeping that habitat elevated above the surface of the water. Luckily, there's a PhD student at University of Wyoming who is a geomorphologist, hydrologist guy, who is like working on the dynamics of how flows on this section of the Niobrara are affecting sandbar morphology and how those sandbars change over the course of a summer. So I think they're coming at it from that angle to look specifically at how the flows are affecting the habitat, because that does seem to be the main issue here, is that that the habitat isn't being created as
So
we
you're
expect.
implying instead of going from a sort of leave it alone flow regime, you're going to do some manipulative things to regulate flooding on the Niobrara.
Hypothetically, it could happen. I mean, it does have a relatively natural flow, and it is unique in that way, but there are some indirect human impacts that are affecting it. That sand that's backing up from the Missouri River is really affecting the depth of the Niobrara. And there's also one opportunity for potential change is there's a dam that's right at the upriver end of the Niobrara study site that I had. It's a run-of-the-river dam, so it's not like regulating water flow. But it is catching some sediment. So that dam was run by the Nebraska Public Power District, but recently it was only making like 3 megawatts or whatever. It was a very small hydropower dam, and they're like, it's not worth it anymore. So now that area is going to be managed by a coalition of natural resource agencies. So it's possible in the future that the way that dam operates on the Niobrara River could change. So someone who knows a lot about sediment movement and sandbar formation and could maybe provide some input on how management of that dam could affect the habitat downstream on the Niobrara. So, is there any part of your question that I left out? I feel like I started rambling. Yeah, I guess another complicated thing with the way river flow happens in the system is it's I think like 90% groundwater fed. So you've got the sandhills in Nebraska, and the water just percolates through there. And so most of the Niobrara River's flow comes from groundwater. So, and there's like a 4-year delay between what's happening precipitation-wise and what's happening flow-wise on the Niobrara. So there's, it's not a 1-to-1 relationship always between like, it was a rainy year, we've got lots of water. It was a drought year, we don't have lots of water. There's like a delay there, so it's complicated.
Along similar management lines, in such a dynamic, stochastic system, would you say that if the birds recover to the numbers pre-decline, sort of 60 pairs-ish, would that be job done, or would there still be concern?
Yeah, I mean, I would think restoring them to their, their population fluctuates yearly with the amount of habitat that's available, but restoring them to this pre-decline number would, yeah, I would think that would be a goal.
Anyone else? Okay, well, maybe let's thank Meryl one last time.
Thank you.